الاميركي السابق في بيروت ديفيد هيل. صحيح ان الدبلوماسي الامريكي المخضرم لم يعد يتحدث باسم الاداره الامريكيه الحاليه، لكن في جعبه الرجل الكثير من المعلومات، وهو ملم بتفاصيل الشان اللبناني منذ ثمانينيات القرن الماضي. فماذا يقول اليوم عن نتائج الانتخابات النيابيه، وماذا عن تشكيل الحكومه المقبله، ولماذا اعتبر ان الوضع اللبناني مقبل على شلل سياسي؟ مرحبا بك حضرة السفير على شاشة الجديد. اسمح لي بداية في السؤال الأول، على عكس كثيرين اعتبرت أن نتائج الانتخابات النيابية قد تؤدي إلى شلل سياسي على الرغم من فوز عدد كبير من المستقلين في هذه الانتخابات.
First of all, thank you, Ramiz. It's great to see you, and thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation. I think it's important to be realistic about the constraints in Lebanon's political system and the way of governance. And while there were some very interesting new developments in these elections in terms of the independents winning in many seats and some of the changes in terms of the votes in the Christian community, overall, I do believe that there is a great risk that Lebanon will continue to endure the paralysis that it has suffered for so many years.
بالحديث عن المستقلين، هل برأيك هم قادرون اليوم على إحداث خلط في اللعبة السياسية وتحقيق إصلاحات معينة؟
Well, it's up to them and how they perform when they go into parliament. It will depend on what kind of coalition takes the majority share in parliament and whether they're part of that. But again, there are only, as I understand it, about 13 of them, and while that's a significant improvement upon the past in terms of the presence of independence, it's really not enough on its own to make a difference. But they can definitely have their say. A lot will count on whether they are able to unite and compromise, which are two words that are often missing in situations like this.
يبدو أن الأمور في لبنان متجهة إلى انتخاب الرئيس نبيه بري. هل برأيك أن هناك تمايز بين بري وحزب الله؟
Well, it's not for me to get into those questions. They're obviously closely allied. They have the same coalition list that they run on in the elections. Shia seats are all, I think, held, as I understand it, by these two parties. But we view Hezbollah as its own entity, and it is a terrorist organization, as you know, from the point of view of the United States.
المتحدث باسم الخارجية الاميركية نيل برايس دعا المجلس النيابي الجديد إلى الإسراع في تشكيل حكومة لإنقاذ الاقتصاد. برأيك هل حكومة جديدة قادرة اليوم على إنقاذ الاقتصاد، وأي نوع من حكومة هي قادرة على تحقيق ذلك؟
As I've mentioned in other settings, there are structural challenges because the way the national pact works and the Constitution is to ensure that no one community has a veto over the other, can control the others. So governments have a hard time functioning in the best of circumstances. These are not the best of circumstances. But I am impressed that up until now there's been good work done between the authorities in Lebanon and the IMF. There's a good set of reforms that are on the table. Some require legislation, some require simply actions by the government. The first and most pressing thing to do is to restore confidence in the fiscal sector and stabilize the currency and the finances of the government and of the country. And that's possible, and that can help unlock the support of the IMF and other creditors. But it's going to require tough decisions by a government, which will require the support of Parliament, and that's, I think, going to be very, very challenging.
إذا بناء على نتائج هذه الانتخابات، إلى أي مدى برأيك سيكون سهل تشكيل حكومة جديدة؟
Well, it's always been hard in Lebanon, as you know, to form a government. There often are long periods of a caretaker situation. I think the challenge today is that there's a very narrow gap between majority and minority in the cabinet, so that's a challenge. The other challenge is that to form a government, it has to represent each of the communities, as you know, in Lebanon, Shia, Sunni, Christian, and Druze, with the right proportions. And so I think there is probably a big ideological gap between the Christians who have won this time and the Shia vote, which of course is still voted for Hezbollah. And I think that will be a major element of competition in formation of a cabinet that includes representative Shia.
برأيك ما هو الدور الذي من الممكن أن يلعبه المجتمع الدولي في الضغط لتشكيل حكومة، لا سيما أنه يكثر الحديث اليوم عن مؤتمر تأسيسي للبنان؟
Well, even though, as you said, I don't speak for the administration at all, I think that Ned Price got it right in saying that we as outsiders should encourage rapid formation of the government because of the dire circumstances facing Lebanon and its economic and humanitarian crisis. But it's not up to us in any way or any other foreign element to pick and choose or define what flavor of the government the Lebanese want. We want a government that we can work with and that will implement these reforms on an urgent basis, and that can then lead to the unlocking of support from the IMF and from the international donor community. How that is structured and whether there are gatherings to accomplish that or not is, I think, yet to be determined, and not that important. The important thing now is a government that can actually implement the necessary reforms that can turn the corner.
يكثر الحديث اليوم عن مؤتمر تأسيسي ممكن أن يدعو إليه الرئيس الفرنسي مانويل ماكرون. برأيك ما هو جدول الأعمال الذي يجب أن يتضمنه هذا المؤتمر؟
I don't know too much about it. I think it's a conceptual level right now. Again, I think the important focus is on what the Lebanese should be doing, forming a government as soon as possible that can really undertake these reforms, will remain committed to it, and will show to your friends around the world, and you have many who want to help, that the political will exists, that there'll be sustained commitment and actual implementation of these reforms that will warrant us and make our support valuable and meaningful.
إذا بالانتقال إلى الانتخابات الرئاسية المسمع حصولها في تشرين المقبل، وحضرتك كنت سفير بين الفراغ الرئاسي عام 2014، برأيك إلى أي مدى نحن مقبلون أو ممكن أن نشهد فراغ رئاسي مباشر؟
Well, I think it's a risk. It's a risk every 6 years. Every 6 years there seems to be a crisis over the presidency. This is one of the structural facts of life in Lebanon. I think there are limited options right now. Again, as an analyst, I'm not speaking in any way as a policymaker. There are limited options right now in front of the Lebanese on how to go about this. It's very hard, in my experience, for them to find compromise candidates. So unless you can get 2/3 support for either an extension of the president or a compromise candidate or somebody else, you are looking at, by definition, you are looking at a potential gap, which would be very unfortunate for everyone.
هل برأيك أن الرئيس ميشيل عون سيسعى إلى التمديد؟
I have no idea. That would be a question for the president.
الرئيس سعد الحريري كان متواجد منذ يومين في واشنطن. هل برأيك هناك دعم أمريكي ما لإعادة تولي رئاسة الحكومة، وكيف تنظر إلى تعليق عمله السياسي؟
Well, again, these are decisions that he and his colleagues make without consulting us. It's not an American decision in any respect. We do have warm regards for him and for his colleagues. We have enormous respect for the family and all that they have donated and all that they have lost for historic history in Lebanon. But these decisions are for Mr. Sheikh Saad to make, not for us. And I have to again ask him. We want to work with anybody, I want to emphasize anybody who shares the goals that we have in terms of reform for Lebanon so it can pull itself out of this extraordinary crisis that has befallen the country.
What about his suspension of his role in politics?
Again, these are decisions for him to make.
I think he gave a chance to independents to win more seats.
Yeah, I do. I think without him, and it showed why there are these structural obstacles to independents winning because of the way the lists work. You know, if you're not on a list with a dominant leader, it's very hard to get elected. But when he pulled out, there was no dominant list. And that was that opening that so many of these independents were able to use to make themselves known and to compete.
هل برأيك اليوم لبنان هو أولوية بالنسبة إلى هذه الإدارة الأمريكية وهو على جدول أعمالها في الشرق الأوسط؟
Lebanon has always been an issue of concern for the United States. We care deeply about its survival and its health. We have many friends there. It's a country that has a form of democracy that we welcome. There are many, many active Lebanese Americans in my country who care deeply about Lebanon and make sure that American policymakers are focused on it. We know from experience that when things go wrong in Lebanon, they don't stay in Lebanon. They affect all of us. And so all of us need to be smart about ways to help Lebanon achieve true stability.
هناك اتهامات توجه إلى الإدارة الأمريكية في لبنان لأنها لا تفرض عقوبات على حلفائها من السياسيين برغم فسادهم وتكتفي بمعاقبة السياسيين المقربين من حزب الله. فكيف تعلق على هذا الأمر؟
Well, I mentioned in an article I wrote recently that my impression is that it is a misconception to believe that sanctions on the non-Shia allies of Hezbollah, as opposed to sanctioning Hezbollah, but sanctioning their allies, does not achieve, if the goal is to reduce the power of Hezbollah, it is not achieving that goal. Now, there may be other reasons to impose those sanctions in terms of the behavior of certain individuals, corruption and so forth. But if the larger goal is, in fact, to somehow reduce Hezbollah's power, I don't see it as achieving that goal. I think Hezbollah's power rests elsewhere, outside its alliance.
سأختم حضرة السفير بالسؤال الأخير بالنسبة إلى انفجار أو تفجير 4 آب. برأيك هل سنصل إلى محاسبة المسؤولين عن هذا التفجير في ظل المحاولات لإزاحة القاضي طارق بطار عن موقعه؟
Well, again, it's really, I think, inappropriate for me as a friend but a foreigner to comment on judicial matters, investigations like that. I was in the port a few days after the explosion. I was in the neighborhoods that were destroyed. It was shocking. And it's shocking today that all this time that has passed, almost 2 years, and there's been really no effective investigation or accountability for what happened. And I think, and I know from my friends in Lebanon, that this is a source of enormous frustration. And the friends of Lebanon outside the country do not understand why there can't be a sustained effort to address it.
وصلنا إلى ختام هذه المقابلة. شكرا على وقتك حضرة السفير ديفيد هيل. شكر موصول لكم مشاهدينا على حسن المتابعة لهذه المقابلة الخاصة من واشنطن.